Mark V. Wetherington, American Agriculture Introduction to American Agriculture, explores the history of farming in the U.S., from its Amerindian roots to modern-day industrial agriculture. Highlights the challenges small family farms face due to large industrial farms. Themes of control, consolidation, and chemical farming. Discusses how control of resources, consolidation of farms, and chemical farming have shaped agriculture in America. These themes connect to broader historical trends, including the dispossession of native peoples, the rise of large-scale farms, and environmental degradation. Historical overview, Chapters 1–2, focus on gender roles in agriculture, cash crops, and the growth of slavery. Chapters 3–5, cover the Civil War, Reconstruction, and post-war expansion, showing the North's economic consolidation. Chapters 6–7, discuss 20th and early 21st century advancements in chemical farming, including the impact of scientific and technological progress. Chapter 8 addresses contemporary farming issues, such as the farm crisis, NAFTA, and the ongoing challenges faced by small farmers. Impact of industrial farming explains the decline of small farms, the rise of Big Farm America, and the role of federal farm programs, chemical companies, and large agribusiness in shaping modern agriculture. Future of farming considers the sustainability of current farming practices, the declining farmer population, and the potential consequences of technological advancements like precision farming and robotics. Wendell Berry's perspective advocates for small-scale, low-input farming driven by love for the land and a sense of stewardship, contrasting it with the industrial farming model. Chapter 1 Beginnings Origins of Agriculture in the U.S. The precise origins of agriculture in the U.S. are unclear, with no single accepted theory. American Indians had domesticated food plants thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Archaeologists and other specialists continue to explore the beginnings of agriculture, with ongoing debates and new discoveries. Domestication of corn. The Zapotec Indians of southern Mexico domesticated corn over 7,000 years ago, one of the earliest centers of corn origin. By 4,000 years ago, small corn varieties were cultivated in present-day New Mexico. The domestication of other plants and the understanding of their nutritional and medicinal value also developed in this period. Transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming was influenced by factors like climate change and population pressure. The development of tools, cord, and small ropes preceded the advent of agriculture, which began about 17,000 years ago. In regions unsuitable for agriculture, hunting and gathering persisted. Independent development of agriculture. Agriculture possibly developed both from internal resources and external influences, with several sites worldwide identified as centers of plant domestication. In the U.S., evidence suggests plant domestication in the eastern regions around 5,000 years ago, later than in Mexico and South America. Spread and impact of agriculture. Agriculture spread unevenly, with many groups supplementing their diet with wild plants and game for thousands of years after farming began. The domestication of plants and animals led to changes in social structures, creating more permanent settlements. Use of fire in agriculture. Fire was employed by Amerindians to manage the landscape, clear underbrush, and create fields for planting. Crude tools like stone axes were used to girdle trees and prepare land for planting. Role of women in agriculture. Women were central to agriculture, likely beginning with the replanting of roots and tubers before seed-based farming developed. They were also responsible for gathering wild plants, nuts, and herbs, and managing the preservation of seeds for future planting. Early European observations. Early European explorers noted extensive Indian agriculture, with cleared lands for planting corn, beans, and squash, and evidence of long-established farming practices. They observed the effects of slash-and-burn techniques on the environment and the landscape, including the creation of microclimates. Importance of maize. Maize became a central crop for Amerindians, featuring prominently in their diet and even in their creation myths. The plant underwent significant changes through selective breeding by the Indians. Indian population and agriculture. The Indian population along the Atlantic seaboard was densely settled in farming communities, especially in regions with fertile land and good hunting grounds. Different varieties of corn, including tropical and eastern flint corn, adapted to various climates and were spread across regions. Agricultural practices and migration. Indian agricultural villages were often located near rivers and creeks, using fertile floodplain soils for cultivation. As fields became depleted and game scarce, Indians frequently moved to new areas, creating new fields and settlements. Environmental impact and sustainability. The practice of burning woods to promote new growth had both positive and negative impacts, including depletion of resources over time. The cyclical nature of farming and migration influenced the landscape and ecosystems, as well as the sustainability of agriculture. Specific regional practices. In regions like the Barrier Islands of Georgia, the introduction of permanent farming communities and maize occurred about 4,500 years ago. The arrival of Europeans led to the exploitation of Indian labor for agriculture, particularly by the Spanish in the Caribbean. Spanish mission era in Guali, 1568 to 1684. Spanish missionaries' arrival gradually disrupted American Indian agricultural practices. The encomienda labor system was established, where Spanish conquerors were rewarded with native labor to work the land. The system relied on the approval of native chiefs, was led by friars, and protected by soldiers. Aimed to integrate natives into the Spanish Empire by Christianizing them, teaching Spanish, and offering protection from tribal enemies. Native hereditary chiefs retained authority in non-religious matters, selecting unmarried males for farm and construction labor in exchange for trade goods. The system was abusive, causing the movement of workers and the spread of disease, leading to depopulation of some villages. Resistance to the Spanish arose in the 1570s, leading to Jesuit exodus and continued unrest with Franciscan missions by the 1590s. The Spanish suppression of native customs and accusations of witchcraft led to the revolt of 1597, which ultimately destroyed the Guali people. Early European farming attempts. First European farming attempts were by Spanish settlers near St. Augustine, but were destroyed by Sir Francis Drake in 1586. Early European explorers and settlers were largely unsuccessful in agriculture, relying heavily on native food supplies. In New Mexico, Juan de Oñate attempted to establish a Euro-American agricultural foothold in 1598, introducing crops like wheat and chilies. The settlement faced revolts due to forced food levies on pueblos, leading to its eventual disbandment, though some friars remained. Euro-American agriculture's struggles and adaptations. The Spanish, French, and English expeditions focused on quick wealth rather than establishing permanent farming communities. Farming was often considered a low-status activity, delegated to lower-class citizens and, later, African slaves. Early Euro-American farming techniques copied Indian methods, such as hoe cultivation and hill planting. Over time, Europeans recognized the importance of sustainable farming practices used by Amerindians. Violence and exploitation in agriculture. Euro-Americans often resorted to violence when natives tired of supplying food, leading to conflicts and massacres, such as the Acoma Massacre, 1598 to 1599. Nature and agriculture also caused significant environmental changes, with deforestation and land degradation common. The need for agricultural land for cash crops like tobacco in Virginia led to continuous exploitation and displacement of native populations. British colonial policies increasingly favored exploiting the New World for materials like hides, timber, and sugar, often at the expense of native populations and environments. The role of indentured servants and slaves. In the Caribbean, English colonists initially relied on white indentured servants but switched to African slaves by the mid-17th century. Barbados became a significant site of sugar production, using enslaved Africans as permanent labor. In Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay region saw a shift towards tobacco farming, initially relying on white indentured servants, with laws stretching their periods of servitude. New England settlers, encountering a different environment, used plows and quickly established self-sufficient agricultural communities, supporting trade and export by the 1640s. Agricultural challenges and developments in different regions. In New England, farming focused on self-sufficiency and trade, with the landscape resembling English woodlands. Unlike southern regions, New England agriculture relied on plows and developed a surplus for trade, particularly with the West Indies. By the mid-17th century, New England became a vital part of the transatlantic trade, supplying grain, fish, and timber to various colonies and Europe. Agricultural Revolution, 16th to 19th century, period and location. Gradual agricultural revolution began in the 16th century and extended into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, primarily centered in Great Britain, present-day Netherlands, and Belgium and France. Key innovations: introduction of cover crops, e.g., turnips, and fodder crops, e.g., alfalfa, clover, added fertility to the soil. Complex crop rotation patterns emerged, notably the use of turnips, leading to an 80% increase in food production. The enclosure movement rationalized archaic land ownership systems, pushing rural families into urban areas. Social changes, shift in attitudes among landowners and farmers, especially wealthy estate owners, who began to take interest in increasing land productivity. Farming gained social prestige, particularly in Britain, where wealthy men established farming libraries as a retreat from politics. Rise of capitalist economy saw wealthy rural elites becoming managers and entrepreneurs in agriculture. Landholding peasants entered the market economy, transitioning from crop-based rent to cash rent. Origins of colonial farmers' demographics. By the late 18th century, about 60% of the U.S. white population was of English origin, with significant Scotch, Scotch-Irish, Irish, and German populations. English agricultural traditions heavily influenced settlement patterns, particularly the concept of plantations. Regional differences. New England, characterized by farming villages with subsistence crops, common landholdings, and private tracts resembling American Indian land practices. Southern plantations, large, commercially focused plantations, e.g., tobacco, rice, often owned by single families and worked by slave labor. Middle colonies and backcountry, expansion into the interior driven by individual family-owned farmsteads, reflecting a mix of English, German, Scotch-Irish, and Quaker farming traditions. Farming society in colonial America. Regional agriculture, economic conditions, New England, short growing season with subsistence farms. Coastal areas more commercialized. Southern backcountry, sparsely settled, with diversified small family farms and livestock herding, contrasting with large plantations. Migration and settlement. Backcountry settlements grew rapidly, especially among Scots-Irish and Germans, leading to the creation of new counties and communities. Yeoman farmers represented the largest group of rural farmers, owning small farms, 100 to 200 acres, raising crops for subsistence and small surpluses. Social structure. Land ownership defined status, with a clear divide between wealthy commercial farmers, yeomen, and landless poor, including indentured servants and slaves. Slavery dominated the Southern economy, especially in plantation areas like South Carolina, where the population was majority black by the mid-18th century. Politics and social structure. Political landscape. Virginia, early voting rights tied to land ownership, with laws gradually expanding to more settlers as land became available. Colonial militia. Both elite planters and yeoman farmers participated in militias, driven by fears of British tyranny and the need to control slave populations. Social dynamics. Georgia experiment attempted to create a utopian society with equal land distribution and no slavery, but by 1760, slavery and monoculture had taken hold. Revolutionary impact. The American Revolution bolstered farmers' confidence and solidified the agrarian leadership of figures like Washington and Jefferson. Post-Revolution agriculture, westward expansion. The farming frontier expanded into the Appalachian Mountains, with settlers pushing westward despite challenges. Continued practices. Agricultural practices remained largely unchanged, with manual labor and animal power dominant, but land depletion and soil exhaustion were growing concerns. Period and location. Spanned from the 16th century to the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Primarily centered in Great Britain, present-day Netherlands, and Belgium, and France. Key innovations. Cover and fodder crops. Introduction of crops like turnips and alfalfa, which enriched soil fertility. Crop rotation. Emergence of complex patterns, notably the four-field rotation with turnips, leading to an 80% increase in food production. Enclosure movement. Rationalization of land ownership, consolidating small plots into larger farms, driving rural populations to urban areas. Shift in attitudes. Wealthy estate owners began focusing on increasing productivity, bringing prestige to farming. Capitalism in agriculture. Wealthy rural elites transitioned into managers and entrepreneurs within the agricultural sector. Market economy. Peasants shifted from paying rent with crops to cash-based rents, integrating into the broader economy. Origins of colonial farmers' demographics. By the late 18th century, roughly 60% of the U.S. white population was of English origin, with significant Scotch, Scotch-Irish, Irish, and German populations. English influence. English agricultural traditions, especially the plantation system, heavily influenced colonial settlement patterns. Regional differences. New England, characterized by farming villages focused on subsistence crops, with land practices echoing those of Native Americans. Southern plantations, large, commercial plantations, e.g., tobacco, rice, dominated, owned by families and worked by enslaved people. Middle colonies and backcountry. Expansion into the interior led to family-owned farmsteads, reflecting diverse European farming traditions. Farming society in colonial America. Regional agriculture. New England, short growing seasons led to subsistence farming, while coastal areas saw more commercial activity. Southern backcountry, dominated by small, diversified farms and livestock herding, in contrast to the large plantations of the coastal South. Migration and settlement. Rapid growth of backcountry settlements, particularly among Scots, Irish and Germans, leading to the creation of new communities. Economic conditions. Yeoman farmers, the largest rural group, owning small farms, 100 to 200 acres, and producing primarily for subsistence. Social structure. Land ownership defines social status, with a clear divide between wealthy farmers, yeomen, and the landless poor, including indentured servants and slaves. Slavery, central to the Southern economy, particularly in plantation areas like South Carolina, where the black population was a majority by the mid-18th century. Politics and social structure. Political landscape. Social dynamics. Georgia experiment, attempted to establish a utopian society with equal land distribution and no slavery, though by 1760, slavery and monoculture prevailed. Revolutionary impact. The American Revolution strengthened the agrarian leadership of figures like Washington and Jefferson, bolstering farmers' confidence. Post-revolution agriculture. Westward expansion. Farmers pushed into the Appalachian Mountains, despite challenges, expanding the farming frontier. Continued practices. Agricultural methods remained largely unchanged, relying on manual labor and animal power, but issues like soil exhaustion became significant concerns. Virginia, voting rights initially tied to land ownership, gradually expanded as land became more accessible. Colonial militia. Both elite planters and yeoman farmers participated, motivated by fears of British tyranny and the need to control enslaved populations. Chapter 3. Market revolutions. Market houses in U.S. cities. 1950s to 1960s. Large market houses were common in many U.S. cities during the 1950s and 1960s. They served as venues for farmers and fishermen to sell produce directly to urban customers. These markets were symbols of a city's commercial success. Charleston, South Carolina's market, dating back to 1788, was founded on land donated by Charles Cotesworth Pinckney with the stipulation that it always be a marketplace. Over time, traditional vendors were replaced by those selling non-food items like t-shirts and beach towels. Market revolution. 18th to 19th century historian John L. Larson described the market revolution as a transformation from a collection of independent households and regions to an integrated industrial state. Post-American Revolution. U.S. population was approximately 4 million, with most involved in agriculture. By 1860, the population expanded to nearly 32 million, with diverse occupations including factory workers and shopkeepers. Agricultural focus of the market revolution. The market revolution in agriculture refers to developments in science, technology, transportation, communication, and immigration. These developments opened new domestic and international markets for U.S. farm products. Key time frame: 1790s to early 1850s. Significant urbanization and natural disasters, e.g., drought, blight, famine, increased demand for American crops. Farming population dropped from 90% to about 60% by the eve of the Civil War. Colonial period agriculture and trade. Farmers relied on waterways for market access due to poor road conditions. Virginia and Maryland. Agricultural produce was shipped from Chesapeake Bay to coastwise or transatlantic markets. Major seaports like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were key trade centers. Coastal trade was conducted via two-mast schooners and single-mast sloops between southern and northern ports. Dutch traders initially dominated northern coastal trade but were eventually supplanted by New England and mid-Atlantic traders. Shift in agricultural production and trade, 1800s by 1860. Settlement extended from the Appalachian Mountains to the upper Mississippi River Valley, Missouri, Iowa, and beyond. Westward migration was driven by agricultural depression and lack of land in New England. Competition emerged between farmers in the fertile western lands and those in the northeast, leading to shifts in crop production. Farmers in areas like western New York adapted by focusing on dairy and butter production as grain production moved west. Impact of the Erie Canal. 1825, the Erie Canal linked Buffalo, New York, to the Hudson River and New York City. It spurred rapid growth in New York City as a commercial hub and connected the Midwest to the Northeast. The canal network fostered the development of urban centers between Albany and Buffalo. By 1861, over 4,000 miles of canals existed, primarily in the North and Midwest. Westward migration and agricultural expansion. The 1850s saw significant westward migration, with 300,000 settlers from New England and New York and 750,000 German immigrants arriving in the upper Mississippi Valley. Railroads and new agricultural technologies, e.g., reapers, plows, canning, facilitated increased crop yields and trade. Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin became leading wheat-growing states by the 1850s. Urbanization and market growth. 1860s, the combined urban populations of the Northeast and Midwest reached nearly 50% by 1860. Growing urban markets in the Midwest, e.g., Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago, drove demand for agricultural products. Railroads and canals linked these urban markets, supporting the movement of food and people. Southern agricultural practices. The South focused on non-food cash crops like cotton, relying on the Midwest for food imports. Wealthy Southern planters used enslaved labor primarily for commercial crop production. The South had fewer transportation infrastructure developments compared to the North, with limited canals and isolated railroads. Ohio River and inland waterway trade. The Ohio River was a critical natural highway for transporting agricultural products to the Gulf of Mexico. Farmers established market towns along the river, where produce was collected and shipped. Shipbuilding along the Ohio River was a significant industry until the Embargo Act of 1807 and the rise of steamboats. Embargo Act of 1807. The Embargo Act imposed a complete embargo on foreign trade, intended to protect American shipping during the Napoleonic Wars. The act, however, harmed domestic farming and manufacturing, reducing coastal and transatlantic trade along the Ohio River. Inception of steamboat era. 1811, the steamboat New Orleans made a significant trip from Pittsburgh to New Orleans in 1811, marking the beginning of the steamboat era on the western waterways, which included major rivers like the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri. This vast network covered nearly half of the continental United States. Growth and challenges. Steamboat traffic grew gradually, becoming common on most rivers by the 1820s. By 1817, steamboats were in St. Louis and later on the Missouri River. The completion of the Louisville and Portland Canal in 1830 improved navigation past the Falls of the Ohio, increasing steamboat and flatboat traffic significantly, with over 800 vessels passing through its locks in the first year. Urban expansion and economic shifts. The steamboat era catalyzed the growth of interior cities like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis, which became crucial economic hubs and agricultural trade centers. These cities, referred to as the urban frontier, expanded due to the demand for wide wharfs and accessible warehouses. Meanwhile, older coastal cities like Charleston and Savannah declined in economic significance. George Keats and Market Revolution. 1819, George Keats, brother of poet John Keats, settled in Louisville, Kentucky, in 1819, investing in steamboats, flour mills, and sawmills. His ventures reflected the market revolution's capitalist activities, including land speculation, manufacturing, and transportation. Keats also leased enslaved African Americans to support his enterprises, highlighting the intersection of slavery and capitalism. Expansion to the Cotton Belt. Steamboats reached the Cotton Belt in places like Macon, Georgia, by 1827. They gradually replaced unpowered barges and became essential for transporting cotton and supplying plantations with goods. However, steamboats were less reliable than railroads due to risks like boiler explosions and collisions. Employment and economic roles. Steamboats provided jobs for riverbank farmers and enslaved African Americans, who were hired out as deckhands and pilots. They transported cotton, livestock, wool, and other products to coastal markets, playing a crucial role in the economy of the Lower South. Environmental and social impact. The spread of cotton farming into new areas like the ACF Basin led to environmental degradation, deforestation, and soil erosion. It also resulted in violence against Native Americans and the displacement of small farmers. Steamboats linked these regions to external markets until railroads emerged in the 1850s. Urbanization and consumer goods. River towns like Albany and Eufaula became hubs for trade and consumer goods, providing farmers with tools, groceries, and supplies. Women in these regions had greater access to materials for clothing, although the extent of benefits varied based on involvement in cash crops. Shift in trade directions. Initially, trade in the wheat and corn belts was directed towards St. Louis. However, with the advent of railroads, Chicago replaced St. Louis as the primary Midwestern trade center. Chicago's connections to the Great Lakes and Erie Canal solidified its role as a major grain trading hub, surpassing New Orleans by the 1850s. Railroads and economic transformation. Railroads began to outpace steamboats in importance by the 1830s, especially in the Northeast and Midwest. Cities like Chicago, linked by extensive rail networks, became major immigrant destinations and economic centers. The Midwest, particularly Chicago, became the nation's breadbasket, with a well-developed transportation system for agricultural products. Immigration and agricultural development. Immigrants, especially Germans, Eastern Europeans, and Scandinavians, settled in the Midwest, contributing to the development of the dairy and hay belt. This region became central to milk, butter, and cheese production, with Chicago as a key distribution center despite the challenges of transporting perishable goods. Technological innovations. The construction of the Charleston and Hamburg Railroad, the longest in the nation at that time, reflected the South's reliance on cotton. However, the Midwest and Northeast developed more extensive rail networks, transforming the economic landscape and linking major cities to national and international markets. Conclusion. The steamboat era was a transformative period in American history, driving the expansion of interior cities, altering trade patterns, and setting the stage for the rise of railroads. It played a crucial role in the market revolution, the spread of slavery, and the development of new agricultural frontiers, leaving a lasting impact on the nation's economic and social structures. Prairie characteristics. Unlike eastern farmlands reclaimed from forests, the tallgrass and shortgrass prairies were largely treeless and covered a vast area, rivaling the size of the United States east of the Mississippi River. These prairies were ecosystems of surprising biodiversity, with over 250 plant species. Destruction of the prairie ecosystem. By the 1930s, the ecosystem of the Great American Desert, a term coined by eastern settlers, was destroyed. This included the disappearance of tallgrass prairie dogs, whose tunnels aerated and captured rainwater, and the American bison, which grazed and fertilized the grasses. Early encounters with the prairie. Settlers first encountered prairies before reaching the tallgrass prairie of northwestern Indiana and northern Illinois. Kentucky's tallgrass plain, noted on John Filson's 1784 map, was settled between 1790 and 1820, and soon cultivated. Ohio's tallgrass prairies were also settled by farmers around the same time. Challenges of prairie farming. Farmers faced significant challenges with the thick, deep, and wet tall grass. Traditional plows were ineffective due to the prairie's underground biomass, which made the grass fire tolerant. Fires, both natural and man-made, helped reduce invasive species and stimulated spring grass growth. John Deere's contribution. John Deere, a bankrupt blacksmith, developed a self-cleaning steel plow in the 1830s that revolutionized prairie farming. This invention, along with other technologies like water-pumping windmills and mechanical reapers, facilitated the conversion of grassland to farmland. Expansion into Iowa and Minnesota. As Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri became crowded, settlers moved westward into Iowa and Minnesota. The first lands in Iowa were opened to settlers in 1833 after the Black Hawk War, leading to a land rush. By 1840, a significant portion of Iowa's prairie was settled, and by 1850, half of it had been plowed under. Impact on native tribes. The displacement of the Sauk, Fox, and other tallgrass tribes was similar to the fate of other farming nations displaced by white settlers. The 1832 Black Hawk War, spurred by land disputes, resulted in the ceding of large tracts of land to the U.S., which were quickly settled by farmers. Jeffersonian ideal. Thomas Jefferson viewed the yeoman farmer as crucial to the nation, tasked with bringing natural resources into productive use. To settlers, uncultivated land was wasted, and dark forests and wild lands were signs of sloth and evil. Agricultural exports and the market revolution. Cotton's dominance. By 1820, cotton had replaced tobacco as the most important U.S. export, accounting for almost 40% of all exports. By the late 1830s, with the expansion of the Cotton Belt, cotton made up over 60% of exports. Southern planters proudly proclaimed the power of King Cotton. Growth of the grain belt. Improvements in transportation, such as steamboats and the Erie Canal, allowed the grain belt to become a major export region. Wheat and flour were important but made up only about 10% of exports, followed by pork. American manufacturing, by contrast, accounted for only about 10% of exports in the 1820s. European subsistence crisis. The Hungry Forties in Europe, exacerbated by the Irish potato famine and failed wheat and rye harvests, created international agricultural markets for American farmers. The repeal of England's corn laws opened the door for American corn exports to Britain, helping alleviate the European crisis. The farmer's role in American society. Farmers' influence. During the early Republic era, farmers were central to transforming the nation's landscape and played a crucial role in displacing American Indians, winning independence, and expanding westward. However, by 1850, their share of the population had dropped from 90% to 64%. Challenges to farmer independence. The Whiskey Rebellion, 1791-1794, highlighted tensions between farmers and the central government, as farmers protested against a tax on distilled liquors imposed to recover wartime debt. This rebellion reflected the growing control of the federal government over citizens' lives. Impact of the market revolution. The market revolution and internal improvements like canals and railroads significantly changed farmers' lives, increasing debt and accelerating the settlement of Western lands. The revolution also altered the family social structure, as the pace of life sped up and the consumption of non-farm goods increased. Women's changing roles. As the market revolution progressed, women's roles in the wage labor society increased. The rise of textile mills and urbanization gave women more autonomy and control over their lives, leading to a decline in fertility rates among white women. Women also played a significant role in dairy markets and other commercial activities, gradually moving away from traditional household labor. Immigration and settlement. The 1840s and 1850s saw a significant influx of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia, many of whom settled in the northeastern and north-central states. These immigrants contributed to the nation's growing transportation and communication systems, with the North benefiting the most from this expansion. Chapter 4. Civil War and Reconstruction's Rural Conditions Pre-War. Location: Eastern U.S., including the Appalachian Mountains and southern coastal plains. Economy: marginally connected to the market revolution and industrialization. Infrastructure: poorly served by railroads and communication systems. War impact: significant struggle in post-war recovery due to labor shortages and the devastation of infrastructure. Post-war labor system. Demographics: 1/3 of Southern soldiers did not return, leading to severe farm labor shortages. New system: emergence of a semi-feudal labor system with freed African Americans and landless white farmers working under landlords. Economic transition: consolidation of farms and the rise of the crop lien system, pushing many small farmers out. Timber industry impact: deforestation: timber companies deforested valleys, stripping local resources crucial for farming. Agricultural shift: land was repurposed for commercial crops like cotton, displacing traditional farming practices. Civil War's agricultural landscape. Farmers' role: the war was fought largely by farmers on rural land, with civilians like Judith Carter Henry being early casualties. Southern economy: the South's reliance on slavery and commercial crops like cotton, hemp, tobacco, and sugarcane was a critical vulnerability during the war. Confederate military: reluctance to arm enslaved African Americans until late in the war further weakened the South's position. Perception of cotton's power, cotton's value. By 1840, cotton exports were the dominant export commodity, leading Southerners to believe it would be a decisive factor in the war. Reality: cotton's strategic value was overestimated. The South's agricultural systems collapse contributed to its defeat. Northern advantages: market revolution benefits. The North's agricultural regions were more productive, better connected, and more industrialized. Military resources: the North had larger, better supplied armies and more robust infrastructure. Bleeding Kansas and pre-war tensions. Hinton Rowan Helper's book, The impending crisis of the South, 1857, highlighted the economic disadvantages of slavery for Southern non-slaveholding white farmers. Slavery's impact. Helper argued slavery hindered Southern economic progress compared to the North. Charleston and slavery. Slave trade hub. Charleston, South Carolina, was a major center for importing slaves, contributing to the expansion of the Cotton Belt. Brutal realities. Enslaved Africans faced horrific conditions and lives of systemic violence and racism. War goals. Southern objective. Preservation and expansion of slavery, described as the Confederacy's cornerstone by Vice President Alexander Stephens. Northern objective. Initially, preserving the Union, but with the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, ending slavery became a war goal. Post-war agricultural depression. General impact. Both U.S. and Western world agriculture suffered a prolonged depression post-war. Railroads. Post-war railroad expansion further entrenched Northern economic dominance. The South's reconstruction. Infrastructure damage. Roads, bridges, and public buildings were destroyed. Fields and farm implements were in disrepair. Women's role. Southern women kept farms running during the war and sought to rebuild homes afterward. Freed African Americans. Population shift. Around 4 million enslaved African Americans were freed, leading to widespread movement in search of family. Freedmen's Bureau. Provided temporary food aid to freed slaves and poor whites. Legal changes. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery and extended citizenship and voting rights to black Americans. Black codes. Southern states passed laws to restrict the freedoms of black farm workers, effectively re-enslaving them. Post-war labor contracts. Sharecropping. Plantations were divided into plots for individual or family farming, with laborious working under contracts enforced by state laws. Economic exploitation. Landlords controlled land and housing in exchange for a share of the crop, perpetuating economic dependency. Broad context. Reconstruction, traditionally viewed as a Southern phenomenon, had widespread national impacts, particularly in environmental terms. The period between 1865 and 1920 saw significant landscape changes due to industrialization and agricultural expansion across the U.S., influenced by minimal federal oversight. Environmental impact nationwide. The Industrial Revolution led to the exploitation of natural resources, transforming landscapes to serve the needs of industry and agriculture. The construction of railroads played a key role in these changes, facilitating the spread of farming towns, granaries, and processing mills, especially in the South and West. Focus areas. Southern coastal plains and southern Appalachia. These regions, spanning 13 states, were less developed but important for cattle grazing and farming. Post-Civil War, these areas began feeling pressures of rural industrialization and monoculture crop production. Great Plains, a major rangeland, stretching from Illinois to the Rocky Mountains, also faced significant environmental transformation, eventually leading to the Dust Bowl crisis. Appalachia and coastal plains pre-industrialization. Both regions were major cattle grazing areas and had not been heavily industrialized or transformed by commercial agriculture by 1880. These regions were important sources of livestock and related products for urban markets. Crop lien system. Southern economy pre-Civil War. The South was heavily agrarian, with 80% of the workforce in agriculture. The coastal plains and Appalachia were remote, sparsely populated, and largely untouched by commercial agriculture. Post-war transformation. The introduction of railroads led to deforestation and the decline of self-sufficient farming in these regions. Timber companies and large agricultural operations took control from local farmers, leading to the rise of the crop lien system, particularly in the coastal plains. Impact on farmers. Small-scale, self-sufficient farms were consolidated into large corporate holdings, pushing many farmers into tenant farming under the crop lien system, which favored cotton production. This system heavily exploited African American laborists, keeping them in poverty and landlessness, while also contributing to the region's social ills, including violence and lynching. Social and economic control. The migration of black and white farmers to the coastal plains post-1880s exacerbated racial tensions and led to a rural dystopia marked by segregation and violence. White supremacy was enforced through economic, political, and social control mechanisms. Lynching and violence. Racial violence, including lynching, was common in areas like Gum Swamp in Georgia, where both black and white tenant farmers struggled over land and labor. The cropland system created a desperate environment where racial tensions often erupted into violence. Appalachia. Historian Ronald Eller describes Appalachia as a region distinct from the broader American experience due to its isolation and slow adoption of commercial agriculture. Post-war changes included deforestation and the rise of mining and timber industries, which displaced small farmers and integrated them into a more rigid, industrial social structure. Great Plains. The Great Plains, encompassing a vast area from Illinois to the Rockies, saw significant changes due to government policies like the Homestead Act and railroad expansion. These policies encouraged settlement and agricultural development, leading to environmental challenges such as the Dust Bowl due to over-farming and drought. Railroads and economic expansion. Railroads were crucial in integrating remote regions into the national economy, driving both agricultural expansion and the consolidation of farmland into fewer hands. This led to the rise of tenant farming and the decline of self-sufficient agriculture. Social hierarchy and economic dependence. The rise of tenant farming and sharecropping entrenched a rigid social hierarchy, with white landowners at the top and black laborists at the bottom. This system perpetuated poverty and limited opportunities for African Americans in the South. Migration and urbanization. The agricultural depression post-Civil War led to widespread migration, with many farmers moving to urban areas or new agricultural frontiers like the Great Plains. This migration was driven by the failure of small farms and the lure of better opportunities in newly industrialized regions. End of open range and dispossession. The destruction of open ranges in the South and West marked the end of traditional farming and herding practices. Corporate land control and the cropland system further marginalized small farmers, particularly women, who lost economic opportunities as self-sufficient farming declined. Long-term impact. The Civil War and subsequent environmental changes had lasting effects on American agriculture, with many farmers losing their land and becoming tenants. The systemic inequalities established during this period continue to influence the agricultural and social landscape of the United States.
Chapter 5. Home on the Range.
Introduction. Farmers were not typically the first settlers in new regions during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Livestock herders usually preceded them. Cowmen from the South Atlantic seaboard moved livestock from the Carolinas and Florida into Georgia, Alabama, and westward to Texas. Spanish ranchers from northern Mexico introduced cattle culture into southern Texas. Eastern cattle expanded into the Ohio Valley, Northwest Territory, and Trans-Mississippi West, pushing the bison further west. Spanish explorers brought horses to the Americas in 1493 and 1519. Open range. The open range system, where livestock roamed freely, existed long before the American West post-Civil War era, contrary to Hollywood portrayals. This practice began with the domestication of animals and was used worldwide, including by Indians, Euro-Americans, and African Americans. The cowboy culture in Texas and the American West resulted from a combination of Amerindian, English, and Spanish practices. Spanish influence and early livestock domestication. Early European explorers noted that dogs were the only domesticated animals among Amerindians. European livestock was likely first introduced by the Spanish on the South Atlantic seaboard and Gulf of Mexico, not by English colonists in Virginia or New England. Spanish explorers like de Soto brought livestock, such as horses and pigs, on their expeditions, some of which became feral or were domesticated by Indians. Spanish missions and livestock management. Spanish missions in the southeastern U.S. introduced livestock, including cattle, hogs, sheep, and horses, to the Timucuan and Guali Indians. The encomienda system controlled Indian labor and introduced livestock into native agricultural practices. Livestock was managed in isolated environments, like barrier islands, where predators were kept in check, and the animals were integrated into mission agriculture. Indian domestication and livestock use. By the end of the colonial period, American Indian animal husbandry was common, and European travelers recorded Indian ownership and use of livestock. William Bartram, an American naturalist, documented Indian use of savannas and woodlands for grazing cattle in the late 18th century. Livestock served various purposes, including as draft animals, food sources, and materials: hide, horns, hair. Colonial livestock practices. Compared to Europeans, Americans focused more on sheep for wool than meat, with sheep grazing on slopes unsuitable for other animals. The Spanish explorers left a legacy of ruins and transformed Indian culture by introducing livestock. Woods ranching. Indian men became the first cowboys, practicing woods ranching in southern pine woods with year-round fodder. Livestock, including hogs left by De Soto, were domesticated by Indians and integrated into their agricultural practices. By 1650, there were about 50,000 native cattle in the British colonies, products of interbreeding among European varieties. Southern and New England livestock development. The first farm animals were brought to Virginia between 1607 and 1611, with significant cattle populations established by the 1630s. South Carolina became an early center for free-range cattle raising, contributing to the colony's economy and the development of the rice industry. In New England, the Narragansett Bay area became a prominent grazing region due to its geography and used by Indians for agriculture and livestock. Southern range and western expansion. The southern coastal plains, from Virginia to Texas, provided valuable grazing lands that attracted small farmers and herders, leading to westward expansion. Communities of herders migrated to southern Georgia and northern Florida, where livestock herding thrived in low-density forest regions. The tradition of open-range herding met the corn-fed livestock culture of the upper Midwest, with regional differences in livestock management practices. Old World influences and legal conflicts. Attitudes toward livestock management in the U.S. were influenced by Old World practices, with mixed farming and open-range systems prevailing in different regions. Southern farmers upheld the open-range custom, even in the face of legal challenges, especially from railroads that killed livestock. The West, early 1800s. Perception as a desert. Early explorers and military expeditions described the Great Plains as a vast internal desert. Native grasses. Despite this, large herds of buffalo and the successful feeding of draft animals on native grasses indicated the region's suitability for grazing. Bison migration. Bison initially ranged as far east as the new American states but moved west of the Mississippi River by 1820 due to human activities and environmental changes. Railroad impact. Between 1850 and 1870, railroads divided the western bison herds into southern and northern groups, leading to their decline due to hunting. Post-Civil War, mid-late 1800s, deforestation and cotton production. In the southern U.S., deforestation and cotton production led to the destruction of productive rangelands, causing environmental degradation and loss of livestock watering sources. Ranching culture. A southern and Spanish free-range cattle-raising culture dominated, especially in Texas, where cattle roamed year-round. Richard King, a key figure in Texas ranching, King rejected the open-range tradition and established large private ranches patterned after Spanish operations. Cattle boom. From 1860 to 1880, cattle numbers in Kansas and Nebraska surged, driven by ranchers moving north from Texas to access railroads for market access. Conflict with farmers. The introduction of barbed wire in the 1860s led to conflicts between ranchers and farmers over land and water rights, culminating in the harsh winter of 1886 to 1887 that ended the open-range era. Cattle industry expansion, late 1800s, early 1900s, California and Oregon. Cattle ranching in California began with Spanish missions, later expanding due to demand from the Gold Rush and Oregon Trail settlers. Decline of open ranges. The expansion of monoculture farming and deforestation led to the decline of open-range livestock production in the East by the early 20th century. Emergence of feedlots. Feedlots became crucial to fatten cattle for market, with the Texas Longhorn breed improved through interbreeding for northern climates. Modern era, post-WWI to present, industrialization of livestock. By 2012, cattle and calf production had grown into a $76 billion industry dominated by four major meatpacking corporations: Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef Packing Company. Consolidation and control. The number of cattle ranchers dropped significantly from 1.6 million in 1980 to 950,000 in 2010, with smaller operations being squeezed out by larger corporate entities. Fracking impact. The rise of fracking since 2000, driven by energy demands and corporate interests like Halliburton, has transformed rural landscapes, causing environmental damage and competition for land and water resources. Factory farming. The consolidation of livestock production into large factory farms has shifted power from traditional farmers to corporate meat packers, resulting in pollution, loss of independent farming, and environmental concerns. Sheep and goat production. The sheep industry has declined since the 1990s, with Texas, California, Colorado, and Wyoming leading in sheep and lamb production. American Indian farms in the Four Corners region are significant producers of livestock, particularly goats and sheep. Environmental and social impact.